On Seahawks Forever today, very excited to welcome into the show the HawkBlogger, Brian Nemhauser, founder of HawkBlogger.com and host of Real Hawk Talk, joining me on the show for the first time. And he's going to give us a little bit of a sneak preview into his 53-man roster prediction just 48 hours or so now from final cuts on Tuesday. Some of those undrafted free agents we've fallen in love with this preseason, those bubble guys, Levi Bell, Patrick O'Connell, some of those receivers. Who does he have making the cut and who does he have missing the cut, including an upset at outside linebacker? And then at the end, I ask him, how much, if any, ground have the Seahawks made up on the 49ers this year? He has a fascinating answer. Stick around for that. But first, hit that like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. Brian Nemhauser, up next on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
It is my privilege to welcome Brian Nemhauser. You know him as HawkBlogger and also from the Real Hawk Talk podcast, joining the show today. Brian, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Absolutely. I want to start here. I know you just put the finishing touches on a column for the site, correct?
I did.
Roughly 24 hours since at least the start of the game yesterday. When you take a general look at the contest yesterday in Green Bay, did any of the players that are on the bubble change your mind about their chances to make the roster, for better or for worse?
Yeah, I think so. I think it starts probably at the receiver spot and not with the name that has been getting all the attention, Jake Bobo. I don't think there's any drama there. He'll make the roster, and I think he'll even potentially be a starter if you consider the third receiver a starter week one, depending on other injuries. But I had gone into this game actually thinking that Tyjon Lindsey was someone who had a outside shot to make the roster, mainly because I think that he is a good returner, and I think he has the potential to be, a fine receiver as well, but mainly because they don't have a good return option. And Aesop Winston Jr., that was the other name that was on my mind, and it was the two of them. And I thought Lindsey maybe had a bit of an edge because I thought he was a better returner. Winston actually got some return opportunities. He made one mistake where he fair caught it inside the 10, but he did, shine again as a receiver. And I think there's a pretty good chance, I would say 70% plus chance, that I think he makes this roster. And of course, as if you want to get into it, I think it's worth just clarifying for folks that the IR rules will play a large role in who makes the first 53-man roster and who makes the ultimate one. And that might affect someone like Winston as well.
Yeah, it's a good point to make. And when I failed to make on my 53-man projection show the other day is there's the Tuesday roster and then there's the Wednesday roster that players have to officially make the 53-man roster in order to be placed on IR with the delegation or the designation to be able to return. A guy like Mike Morris might be a perfect candidate for that. We don't know the severity of his injury, but if it's enough that he's going to miss games, then he would be placed on the roster on Tuesday and then placed on IR on Wednesday. That receiver position is interesting because we don't know the status of Jackson Smith and Jigba. But what you just said about Jake Bobo, even if Njigba's healthy, he's a lock to make the roster and play a role on offense, isn't he?
JSN?
Jake Bobo.
Jake Bobo. Yeah, I think that if JSN is healthy, I think Bobo has a decent shot to be the fourth receiver in that situation. Realistically, the fourth receiver doesn't get a lot of snaps, definitely doesn't get a lot of targets for the Seahawks. And I think you're going to see a lot of three receiver sets when JSN is healthy. And honestly, if he's not, I think you're going to see a lot of multiple tight end sets, multiple back sets that don't feature a third receiver. So I don't think Bobo is going to be someone who's getting a ton of snaps one way or the other. But if JSN is not able to play in that first week, I would think Bobo would be the guy. I don't think that I don't know. There's the Cody Thompson, Cade Johnson crew, and
Right.
been around for a while, and so the
Yeah.
coaches have familiarity with them and probably some trust in them. But I just don't think either one of those guys offers what Bobo offers as a receiver, as a blocker, and they've been struggling with their own health issues. So I think it's pretty clear that Bobo would be that guy. I just I don't think I mean, we're at the point uh, that we're all focused on these edge of the roster guys that
Right.
honestly are not going to really play a big role once the season begins.
Yeah. We are going to talk about one position group where there are some big questions and guys that will play roles on a rotational basis. But before we move over to the defensive side, we haven't seen that running back room be healthy at all through the
Mm.
preseason. Any concerns there heading into week one that those guys are going to be ready to go?
I think the concern for me is a little bit more what I've seen from someone like Zach Charbonnet.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a question about health of Kenny McIntosh. There's some indication that he'll be ready, and if he is, then you're four deep at running back with DJ Dallas and Ken Walker, who seems totally healthy. And then usually they do keep a fifth. I don't know. Like, I'll be very disappointed if they waste a roster spot on Sir Roderick Thompson or something of that nature. But I'm actually predicting they'll have a four running backs on the roster at the 53 to start the year. I just think Charbonnet is a guy that, while I was not at all happy they spent a second round pick on a running back this year at all, I was infatuated with Charbonnet in college, and there was a few mock drafts where I played around with putting him on the roster just because I thought he was such a perfect complement to Kenneth Walker.
Yeah.
And I've been frankly disappointed with how he's played in the preseason. He hasn't been sudden. He's shown some attempts at power, but not really successful power. He's had one big run that was great, but there wasn't like a lot there. So I am hoping that he is just, finding his way, because right now he looks like an average NFL back. And I mean, he's been really good in pass protection, but that's not what you spend a second round pick on. So I'm counting on him being a real weapon for them. And I don't think
Yeah.
he's shown yet that that's what he is.
I question that he had much of an opportunity to really show that yesterday. I got a lot of it. I did some live streaming during the game, and I got a lot of frustration that the Seahawks were intent on running the football on first down for most of that game. I think they only threw on first down once in the first 6 drives, and just were pounding Charbonnet up the middle with a second team offensive line. But yeah, I hear you. He really hasn't done much to stand out. You just wonder how much of that is kind of by design.
Well, that backup line is flat bad.
Yeah.
It really underperformed the whole preseason. I wrote about this in my column this morning on HawkBlogger.com, just that I think we went in thinking that the tackle position, the offensive tackle position, was maybe one of the deeper spots on the offensive line. You've got Abe Lucas and Charles Cross as starters. Stone Forsythe and Jake Curhan have been there for a few years now and have played starter snaps at times and done okay. Both of those guys have played like very poorly. And I think they played again poorly in this game. I think the guard position has not been great. I thought Anthony Bradford had a better game in this one than he's had in some of the past. I think Kendall Randolph is a guy that is someone to watch for practice squad. I thought he's done okay. I think Olu, I know he's been dealing with injuries,
Right.
In his elbow, and you can't underestimate how that could be affecting his play, but he looks like a backup center to me. Like, he doesn't look like a guy that really is a challenge for a starting spot. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope that it's just injuries, and I hope he shows out differently. But I've watched some of the other centers that were drafted ahead of him in this draft, and I think I'm going to be pretty upset if once again the Seahawks bargain shopped on center in a draft when they could have they could have had John Michael Schmitz where they drafted Zach Charbonnet.
Yeah.
And that's, yes, center's not a super important position, but if you can have someone who's Pro Bowl level versus someone who's replacement level, it matters at every position. And I think the Seahawks have missed the chance to upgrade that position time after time after time. And so I'm hoping I'm wrong. I'm hoping it's just injury. But yeah, that line, to your point, I don't think any of the backs' average yards before contact was even at the line of scrimmage.
Yeah.
So it was not good.
Let's talk about this draft class a little bit, because there was so much excitement about it and hype about it. 2 first-round picks, a lot of extra picks, the last bit of assets from the Russell Wilson trade. But to this point, of those 10 picks, 7 of them have missed preseason games.
Mm-hmm.
And an 8th potentially now with Derek Hall, comes out of yesterday with a shoulder injury. We don't know the severity of that yet. So potentially 8 of them go into the regular season injured. Is that a random anomaly that doesn't concern you, or is there a bigger worry there?
Yeah, I think it's always better when they're healthy, no doubt about it. I think you have to avoid general statements across the board when it comes to injury. Devin Witherspoon's got a hamstring injury.
Right.
Is that deeply concerning? No, I'm not deeply concerned about a hamstring injury. Do I wish he wasn't having that? Sure, but that's not something I'm too concerned about. JSN cracked a bone in his wrist.
Thing. Yeah.
That's not great. Hopefully is not something that is a recurring issue, but whatever. Derek Hall, we'll see about this. Pete talked about it's like an AC sprain. I'm not super concerned about that. Charbonnet missed some time, but that ended up not being an issue. You can kind of go on and on and on. There's not a lot of these injuries that give me significant concern. I think the closest might have been Kenny McIntosh, who his knee injury sounded pretty close to being an issue, but it ended up just being a sprain, and they're not thinking he'll be back by the regular season. So no, I don't particularly find myself concerned about the injuries. I'd rather the rookies face some injuries than the starters that we're absolutely counting on. And I think the most important ones here are the first 2 first-round picks, and I think there's reason to think that both of them will be available and big parts of this team this year.
Pete did say yesterday that JSN expects to beat the timeline, whatever that is. They're not really telling us.
Mm-hmm.
And that Devin Witherspoon is running full speed. That was good to hear yesterday after the game. And then it's just a matter of conditioning. So it sounds like he has a good chance to be back. I ask it though, because I'm sure you've heard it on Twitter from other fans. There's a lot of scrutiny with this draft class because of some of the things you've touched on already. That where we took certain guys in the draft, there were other opportunities. And I think that wasn't helped by the fact that John was very, very open and transparent this year about there were some upsets, and there were some guys that they had thought they were going to take at certain points of the draft that weren't available. And now in the preseason, being what it is, we've seen some of those guys that some fans have latched onto and speculated might have been in the mix. We've seen some of the linebacker group, Drew Sanders and Dan Henley, making plays left and right for their teams. We've seen Keanu Benton really have a great preseason at nose tackle for the Steelers. Looks like he's going to start day 1 for them. So, it's kind of that Creed Humphrey phenomenon, right? Where we're going to, as the years go on, we're going to compare this draft class to what we've seen other teams do. So certainly we need those guys. I think the biggest frustration is on that defensive line, because they only spent 2 picks there, day 3 picks, Cam Young, Mike Morris. Looks like neither guy might be ready to go week 1. We haven't seen Cam Young at all. Let's talk about that position, because that's the one we feel good about, the 3 starters, right? But what are we doing behind that? We've seen a bunch of undrafted guys play those reps and get those snaps in the preseason. Is there any chance they go into week 1 against the Rams without adding from the outside to that group?
There's always a chance. I think it would be a big mistake. And I think you have to say there's a chance because we've gotten here based off a series of decisions that John Schneider and Pete Carroll have made at that position during this offseason. Look, there's a name, we've talked about Jalen Carter, and we've talked about, a bunch of other big names. Calais Campbell was there to be had late in the season as a perfectly good and interior defensive lineman. He went to Atlanta, and maybe he never was really an option out here. You never know with free agents who would really consider coming out to Seattle, but there's a pretty long list of players that the Seahawks did not add, whether through the draft or free agency. And I actually am not good with our 3 starters at all. I think Mario Edwards Jr. is one of our starters, and I think he's a journeyman at this point, and he's an
seventh team, I think, in his career.
An okay player, but he's a guy that you want as a rotational guy. And I think Draymond Jones, I feel good about. Do I feel good about Jaron Reed as our starting nose tackle? Not really. I mean, I think, can he be serviceable? Sure. But do I want more than serviceable on the heart of our line? Yeah, I do. So no, I'm not at all satisfied with that group. I was hoping Mike Morris would be healthy, and he seemed to be one guy that was young and had upside. Obviously, Cam Young, we've gotten 0 looks at in competition. It sounds like it's been a calf thing, and they do think, I think, that he's going to be available by the start of the season. Hopefully, Dan, he's good, because I think the other options here are this. One, they make some trade either from late round pick or with some of their depth at edge or a corner or somewhere else for someone else's depth at interior defensive tackle. 2, they find someone on cut down that they like, and by Wednesday of this week they've swapped out somebody. 3, that by week 2 of the regular season, when veteran contracts are no longer guaranteed for the full year, that they sign someone like Ndamukong Suh or something like that. Akeem Hicks, I think, is still out there, but
yes, there's not much out there, but those 2 guys are. Yeah.
So I don't think that they're going to feel desperate enough that they need to add a veteran and guarantee their contract for the full year before week 1. But I think that still is an option. And then there's the big question, I'm sure, is on your mind as well. Do they make a big swing trade?
Right. Yeah. Chris Jones would be obviously the one that all the fans want. That would be a tough one to see happening. Grover Stewart's another one that I get tossed around a lot. Last year of his contract with the Colts. It's such a fascinating year because we've never seen it like this before. We've never seen the one cut. We've seen the phases before. So guys have become available. You can add throughout camp. It's really like a new wave of free agency. It's going to be a crazy 48 hours with the rules on IR and with all those guys becoming free agents at the same time. Any vested veteran, as you touched on, 4 years in the league or more, becomes a free agent immediately. So if those guys become available Tuesday, those moves can be made. But I think a lot of us are going to be waiting for 1:00 Pacific time Tuesday, hoping for some answers, and we're not going to get those answers until Wednesday, really.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked a lot about on our show on Real Hawk Talk about DeForest Buckner. I don't think that these are likely moves to happen. That would certainly be the biggest shift to the Seahawks' potential total win count this year, if you add someone of that quality, that interior defensive line. Otherwise, the reality is, unless the scheme changes are really solid and the players that the Seahawks have on that defensive line play really solidly, I don't think it's realistic to ask them to play above average football. Then it's going to be a real challenge. So I think that there is not a credible case to be made that the Seahawks have meaningfully upgraded their defensive line talent this offseason. Again, for folks, I would delineate when I'm talking about defensive line, I'm talking about the 3-4 defensive ends and defensive tackle, not the edge players like Derek Hall and Boye Mafe and Uchenna Nwosu and so forth. So Darrell Taylor. I'm talking about the actual defensive tackle like players. So it's frustrating to be honest. I don't like having a team that potentially has the profile of getting pushed around for another year.
With that being said, the results defensively have been better this preseason. And for those who say that preseason doesn't matter, last year the Seahawks were terrible in the preseason, defensively, stopping the run especially, and that translated to the regular season. With everything you just talked about personnel-wise, have you seen enough this preseason to lead you to believe that the scheme changes might have an impact, that we might start the season with being a little stingier on defense?
I think so. Interestingly, the Seahawks last year, really where they showed the biggest weakness initially, at least in defending the run, was outside the tackle as opposed to up the middle. And it wasn't necessarily because they were super strong up the middle, but there was a lot of weakness in setting the edge. And so teams were getting a ton, like unreasonable amounts of space running to the outside. And when you get outside, there's just a lot of chunk plays to be had. So I do think that I've seen a little bit better gap discipline and a little bit more of setting the edge and a little bit more of spilling runs back inside, which limits their potential. So that does feel better. I also think, as much as Bobby Wagner's on the older side, I feel just better about him filling gaps and being in the right spot against the run than I do about what they had at linebacker last year. I was certainly not a Cody Barton fan. I know there's some folks that watch a lot of film and will tell you that he's much better than he's given credit for.
Yeah. I
hope he shows that somewhere else. I'm glad he's not going to be trying to show it here. So I think that there's reason to feel, I think there's reason to think that the gap discipline's better, that they'll be a little bit stingier. I think there's also reason to be skeptical and say this is a team that could get mashed again.
Yeah.
And we just have to wait and see.
That's the part that's kind of scary. If you want to stay up late at night and not sleep as a Seahawk fan, scroll through other teams' defensive depth charts. And it's just, even if you just have a cursory knowledge of the league, you look at other teams' second defensive line and you see capable players and guys you're familiar with and guys that rotate in. I mean, you see in our own division, the San Francisco 49ers, of course, known for having one of the most dynamic defensive lines in the league, and they went and added to it and spent big money on Javon Hargrave to fortify that position. So that's a scary one. And when people tell me everything's going to be okay, my response to that is, what if Jaron Reed gets hurt? Like, are you playing Matt Otel as your starting nose tackle, or Jacob Sykes? Or that's where it gets scary. Let's talk about a couple specific guys on your final 53. Every preseason, fans get enamored with undrafted free agents and certain guys and underdogs. Levi Bell, certainly one of those guys, has really flashed. And with all the things we talked about, with those shortcomings up front, do you have him making the roster?
Yeah. Right now, he is on the razor's edge. So if I go and I look at my roster, I've got them I've just bucketed linebacker as one group, even though inside linebacker and edge are significantly different positions. I have him right outside the roster. I have him as 10th on that list. So I'll give you the list of guys that I've got. Inside linebacker, I've got Wagner, Jordan Brooks, Devin Bush. I also have Nick Bellore and John Radigan making this roster. Okay. And Radigan's the one to come back to here. As edge, I've got Daryl Taylor, Uchenna Nwosu, Derek Hall, Boye Mafe making the roster. And so...
Not Tyreek Smith?
Not Tyreek Smith.
Okay.
No, I do not have Tyreek Smith making the roster. I have him right below Levi Bell. So I see Tyreek Smith as a lower ceiling potential player. And I have questions about his ability to really set the edge. I saw Levi Bell do that much, much better. And Levi Bell, I think, is a much better rusher than he is. So I think Smith is a guy that can make it to practice squad. Truthfully, Bell might be able to as well. But Bell has shown, I think, higher level, higher ceiling traits than Smith has.
Certainly more versatile too, which is, it's so interesting to see for his frame and his size. Because I think it seemed to me yesterday, more so than we saw against the Vikings or the Cowboys, he was playing inside in a 4-point stance. And to me, that kind of came across as an intentional thing, given some of those some of those issues with that group to move him around a little bit. We're not going to see that out of Tyreek Smith. That's interesting. I think you're the first guy that has Smith not making the roster. You're the outlier.
Yeah, I think he's had some definitely. His last game was better than this one, but I have not seen what I would want to see from him relative to Levi Bell. And look, I think the coaches are doing everything they can to figure out how they can use Bell. They play him at fullback. They've played him at defensive tackle. They've played him at edge. And he is 265. Their edge players, Mario Edwards, Draymond Jones, they're like 280 plus. Mike Morris is 300. He is not an interior player. I think that was a lot to ask. And he had one play that I thought was decent when he was in there, but for the most part, he was getting washed out inside. But when they put him outside, immediate pressure, multiple pressures, multiple good plays. And that's with spending a lot of energy trying to play inside for the first 15 plays or so of the game. So Bell's a guy that to me has shown significant potential. And that's the guy between him and Tyreek Smith. I would lose a lot more sleep about Bell showing up on another roster, another place than I would about Tyreek Smith. I also think Bell is a better special teams player than Tyreek Smith, and that matters at the edge of the roster.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you've got Radigan making it in that linebacker group. You said you wanted to come back to him. Radigan over O'Connell, another guy that has become a darling of the fans this preseason.
Well, again, this is where the roster math matters, because this is really, when you've got Wagner, Brooks, and Devin Bush as your linebackers, those are the guys that are going to get all the snaps at inside linebacker, unless there's significant injury situation. So these other guys are just depth and special teams is really what it comes down to. So Balor's a guy that I wouldn't have making the roster if he didn't have a guaranteed $2.3 million contract. They're going to eat that whole thing if they cut him, but I don't think he should be on this roster. I think that Tyreek Smith should make the roster instead of Nick Bellore, but I don't think the team's going to cut him and eat that contract. So what that then means is who's the last guy? And by the way, like on my number, I came to 9 here, and that means that Levi Bell doesn't make the roster either.
Yeah.
By the way, but John Radigan does, because they do need. I think he is a better inside linebacker than Nick Bellore. For sure. And I think they've got more time with him on special teams. He's certainly a good special teams player. I think Patrick O'Connell is good, but there's no problem at all putting him on practice squad. They have no worries that someone's going to get him snatched up. Radigan's been an NFL player. I think Ben Burke-Hervin is probably a bigger question than O'Donnell. I think Ben Burke-Hervin arguably has outplayed Radigan this preseason. I think that they think about him as more of a feel-good story than someone that they really want to bet on physically going to be available. They'll probably just try to put him on the practice squad if they want. So there's a chance that they're like, no, we'll actually either go to 10 on this number and then get a Levi Bell or a Tyreek Smith on there, or that they swap out, Bell for Radigan and they go with, basically 3 inside linebackers plus Nick Bellore as the 4th and roll the dice there. That feels a little risky, but that could be something they choose to do.
It does, but it feels like you might be able to steal from that group if you need to, because we've seen it in action and we've heard over and over again, they're going to play so much more nickel this year. We're going to see a lot of one interior linebacker sets, and the way they're going to use those guys, maybe you can steal from that spot, at least initially early in the season.
Agreed.
Especially if you think those guys are going to get through waivers. Let's talk about the back end then before we finish up, because that's been where some of the most interesting battles have been. And the biggest one over the last couple of weeks. It's amazing how quickly Michael Jackson has gone from being, borderline dominant, was in the words of Pete Carroll, in the offseason, all through OTAs and in training camp, and has kind of become a whipping boy of the fans the last couple of weeks. I don't know how much that's warranted. I think some of that's overblown. I thought the touchdown he gave up yesterday couldn't have played it much better. It was a really well thrown ball from a starting quarterback to his starting receiver, perfectly placed. But some people feel like maybe Trey Brown has won that left cornerback spot, and the fact that Jackson played right corner in lieu of Reek Woolen yesterday spoke to that. Do you think Brown's the starter on day one, and how do you see that secondary shaking out assuming that Weatherspoon's ready to go.
It's one of the most fun surprises we're going to get.
It's a good problem to have.
Come week 1.
Yeah.
It would be a great problem to have if they were all playing well and healthy. It's unfortunate that Jackson has not had a good preseason for multiple reasons. Obviously, the more quality depth you have, the better. Also, the potential that he could drive up his trade value, potentially, be someone that they could trade for defensive tackle from another team or something like that if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's lessened for sure. I do read into the fact that he was playing basically backup to Reek Woolen's spot yesterday, and Trey Brown was opposite. I think Jackson has solidly moved out of the starting lineup, and I would have guessed even before last preseason game that was not the case, that he was the odds-on favorite to be the starter opposite of Woolen. I no longer think that's true. I think that most likely Trey Brown will start outside opposite Woolen week 1. I think that I would say it's like 55-45 in that. I think there's a decent chance Witherspoon's just going to slide right in there. And I think that people are probably underestimating Pete and team's willingness to put him out there right away. And he just has to show that he's healthy and can play. So I think there's a better chance of that than maybe people give it credit for. I also think Artie Burns has, as much as Jackson has slid down the ranks, and I think you're right about the different sides. Look, I brought it up in my article today. DJ Reed famously struggled on one side of the field. You put him on the other side, and he's a near Pro Bowl level corner. So it can really matter for certain players. That said, I thought Artie Burns played a terrific game yesterday. Slid in a nickel. I thought he's had a great preseason. I think this is a guy that they thought was going to be a starting corner for them last year before some injuries and other situations took hold. I thought there was zero chance, Dan, that he was going to make the roster. I think he's not quite a lock, but I think it's very likely. If you look at the back end of the roster, I think they keep 10 in the secondary, whether it's 5 corners and 5 safeties, or maybe 11. They've done this in some cases, but I think at least 10, and I think that means Artie Burns is on the roster. I think he'd basically be competing with guys like Joey Blount and Sutherland and Jarek Reed, and I think he's I think solidly ahead of those guys in terms of value. Some of those guys have special teams above him, so we'll have to see what happens there.
And then you mentioned him. Do you have Sutherland making the team over Reed? That seems to be the momentum the last couple of weeks, is that even as a draft pick, which Seahawks like to protect, in this day and age, it's not common for a 6-rounder to get cut. That he struggled a little bit. I thought he played well yesterday. I thought he made some plays, tackle for loss, a really great pursuit on an outside run. He's willing to hit guys, had a pass breakup that I thought was really impressive, cutting on the ball yesterday. How do you have that battle shaking out? Yeah,
right now I have him behind Sutherland and Blount, just from I think that what those guys can bring in terms of the position that they can play at safety, the type of safety they can play, as well as their special teams prowess. I think those guys are ahead of him. I think Reed had a pretty strong preseason. I thought he had a great game yesterday, and I'm not too worried about, honestly, any of those guys not making it to the practice squad if they decided to do it. So I'm not sure it really matters end of the day which of them. It matters for them, obviously, but from a fan perspective, I'm not sure it really matters which ones are up and which ones are not. Artie Burns is a guy, for example, you don't sign him, he's gonna go to another team. He will get an opportunity somewhere, and I think that would be a big mistake.
In what really concerned me about Reed and got me to thinking, because all throughout this process, I've had him on the roster. I thought a lot of that was based on what they said when they drafted him. And that was, he might take some time to develop as a safety, but this guy is going to be great on special teams. When Pete came out the other day and said he's got a ways to go there,
Mm,
and he's got some development. He's got some learning to do on special teams. That's when my eyebrow went up, and I thought, okay, maybe he doesn't have it. Maybe he's not going to make the initial
yeah.
53. Can't let you go without talking a little bit about the quarterback position, and I want to frame it to you this way. We saw almost nothing but Drew Lock this preseason, much more extensively than we saw last year. Of course, he got sick last year. By all accounts, seemed to play well. Has he done enough in your eyes that if anything were to happen to Geno Smith this year, if he were to go down for any length of time, can we win games with Drew Lock? Has he established himself as a guy that can be a starter in the league, as Mark Schlereth proclaimed yesterday during the telecast?
Look, Dan, I don't know if I'm in the minority or I'm just vocal about it. I think that Drew Lock has an very odd amount of support in this fan base for a guy that has never played a regular season snap of football and has made a number of questionable decisions in preseason games when he has been in there, and continues to show questionable decision making, questionable fundamentals. The amount of throws he made yesterday fading away off his back foot, even his touchdown to Bobo there wasn't someone that he had needed to step back from, but he was throwing off his back foot. He threw another pass into harm's way yesterday that very clearly could have been intercepted, and it was a play where he had decided where he was going to go with that ball before the snap and just threw it out there.
That should have been a pick six.
I think people really overweight the good plays and underweight the bad plays at a position where mistakes are just paramount. Like, Jimmy G was a guy that for years he was pretty much guaranteed at least one turnover a game, whether it was a fumble or an interception. And that is a very, very hard way to win unless you're surrounded by the best talent in the league, like the 49ers were with him.
Yeah.
And so I have not seen anything that really makes me think Drew Lock is significantly different than the guy that has thrown as many interceptions as touchdowns in his career as a starter in the NFL. And could he come in and win you a game? Could he be potentially close to 500? Sure. I think that's fine. I don't have this persistent belief that, hey, the Seahawks are a quarterback factory and look what they did with Geno Smith. They'll do it again with Drew Lock. I think that is absolutely completely fan fiction that will happen again. Something that's happened basically once or twice in the history of the NFL.
Yeah.
No, I am not a believer in Drew Lock. I think he's a super nice guy. Seems like the locker room likes him. The coaches like him. He's got special arm talent. I don't think it's elite arm talent. He makes some great throws.
Yeah.
I think he makes some boneheaded mistakes, and I think potentially crippling against first string defenses in the heat of a regular season NFL game. So, I wanted them to draft a quarterback, not at 1, but certainly later. And I think that would have been a much better path for them.
And then I'm going to ask you this next one only because there are so many people that latch on and get passionate about kind of dark horse quarterbacks. And I've had a lot of really passionate comments on my channel about Holton Ahlers. And the question I'm just going to ask you is this. I'm not going to ask you to assess his game. Are the Seahawks going to use the waiver period to try and upgrade that position? Are they out hunting for a guy to put on the practice squad that might be an upgrade over Ahlers, or do you think he's shown enough as a developmental guy?
I think that they will. I think they'll definitely look. I think that would be a mistake not to. I don't think Ahlers has done anything to say, my God, you can't upgrade that spot. I really like that guy. I think he's fun to watch. Even with all the things I said about Locke, I don't think Ahlers should at all be in the conversation for backup or anything like that. So, I think there's clear differentiation there, and Ahlers is pretty raw. I also think his arm talent is pretty questionable. So I think that he probably ends up on the practice squad as a third string quarterback, but it wouldn't shock me if they have someone else they've seen that they think is more interesting.
How much ground, if any, have the Seahawks made up on the 49ers?
This is the fascinating one, Dan. I think that depends as much on the 49ers as it does on the Seahawks. And look, Brock Purdy's a guy that even 49ers fans, there's so much skepticism about him. And, can they really count on this guy? Was he a flash in the pan? As objectively as I can be about it, I'm on the side of, I think he's really good. I don't want that to be the case. I think he's really good. I think that he is going to be potentially great. And I think that alone makes that team incredibly challenging for any team in the league to beat. I think CMC's health is going to be critical. And this is a guy that has missed a lot of time at a position that has a high injury rate. So I do think there's some variability. I think that offensive line is worse. I think that defense potentially is worse. We don't know what's going to happen with the Nick Bosa contract thing. I wouldn't be surprised if he holds out longer. Wouldn't be surprised if he signs right away either. But I think that secondary is questionable. The linebacker position's weaker. So I do think that the Seahawks offense has closed ground with the 49ers defense.
Okay.
I think that the 49ers offense may have gained some ground even on a Seahawks defense that I think is also improved. So a lot of this depends on Purdy. And if he is, most players improve from first year to second year. This is a guy that had a great first year. If he improves on what he did last year, Seahawks are not going to be close to that team.
It's amazing how you touched on it. The perception is flash in the pan. The buy-in from the general public is not there. Right before you and I got on today, I wrapped up a fantasy football draft. Went 19 rounds. I got him in the 19th round. Not quite Mr. Irrelevant because I picked second and it was on the turn. But got him in the last round after. And we draft defensive players and everything. I was shocked by that. I don't see how the guy doesn't throw 30 touchdowns if he's healthy in that offense.
I think it's very possible. And look, I would be so happy to be wrong and see him struggle mightily. And, for that team to end up with Sam Darnold having to start and please.
It's so hard as a Seahawk fan to see your chief rival miss on a top 5 quarterback pick that they traded, a ransom to move up and miss on that and have it not affect them in any way at all.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly did affect them. Like the opportunity cost there is real,
sure.
But you're right. The hit on Purdy, man, it's rough. It's rough as a Seahawks fan. And I don't think you can tip your hat to the 49ers. They used the last pick on the draft on the guy. It's not like they had seen something that nobody else had seen. They lucked into something there. And that's let's hope that it turns out to not be the case, but I'm on the other side of that from a lot of folks, including 49ers fan. I think Purdy's going to be very, very good.
I'm with you on that. I am. And the schedule makers kind of did us dirty by putting both games late in the year. We'd love to see that matchup earlier on. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show and taking the time. Our first time catching up together. Let's make sure it's not our last.
Absolutely, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Let the people know what you got coming up and on the website, HawkBlogger, and on Real Hawk Talk this week.
Yeah, so HawkBlogger.com, you can go there right now. I've got my morning after column detailing the last game against the Packers and some of the impact to the roster and what I think will happen there. Also, we will, on Real Hawk Talk this week, likely do our prediction show, which is a multi-hour extravaganza where we'll go through and predict all the games for the season and the final record and where the season ends. We will also do a lot of prop kind of predictions around what different players will do during the regular season. So keep an eye out for that. We'll do that sometime this week.
I also don't want to let you go without touching on Ben's fund. You donate revenue from your ventures to John Schneider's foundation for his son, Ben, to help support autism programs. The number that you've helped to raise is pretty jaw-dropping. Tell the folks about that.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing it up. When I started HawkBlogger back in 2007, there was nothing of interest. No one wanted to advertise with us. And by the time they started to want to do so, I have a full-time job. I didn't want to make money. I didn't want to do the marketing thing. And then I realized I didn't have to keep it. I could actually donate it. And it turns out my youngest son, Nate, is autistic, and John Schneider and Tracy's son, Ben, is also autistic. And they started Ben's Fund, which basically helps parents of kids with autism afford some of the treatment, expensive treatments that are needed. And so I started taking money from partners and advertisers, and then also started a patreon.com/HawkBlogger if you're interested. And to date, we've now donated over $260,000 to different charities. Most of that's gone to Ben's Fund. A couple years they didn't do their fundraising auction, so we've done to other places like NAMI, which is National Association of Mental Illness, and some other places during the pandemic to help with food for people that were unable to get it. So we've tried to do good with what we're doing, and I'm really humbled by all the people that have supported and helped make that happen.
Well, you've done a lot of that. And my employer, El Gaucho, has always been intimately connected to that, as well as we contribute to the fundraiser that used to hold it at El Gaucho. We did it at Sparkman Winery this year, and that's where you and I got to meet for the first time. So
that is
always appreciated your efforts in that way. At HawkBlogger on Twitter, that's where you'll find him and can follow him for all of his takes on the Seahawks. At Seahawks Forever. For me, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. We will be all over the roster cuts this week on Tuesday and Wednesday. Stay tuned for that. Until next time, forever and always, go Hawks.